There are moments in life when a single sentence, spoken by a child, can alter the course of everything that follows. I did not know, on that gray afternoon in Hyde Park, that my son's innocent words would unlock a door I had believed forever sealed. It was October of 1888, 6 months after I buried my husband. The rain had stopped an hour before, leaving the pathways slick and the benches damp, and I had taken Thomas to the park because our lodgings in Clerkenwell felt too small, too suffocating, too full of the smell of lamp oil and the ghost of formulas my husband had scribbled on every available surface. We had little money. What Edward left behind was not an inheritance, but a tangle of debts, half-finished machines, and whispers that followed me through the market like a cold draft. Whispers that my husband had been brilliant, yes, but also reckless. That his experiments had ventured into territories no decent man should explore. That his death, though declared an accident, had been anything but. I did not defend him to the women who turned their faces away when I passed. I did not have the strength. I simply held Thomas's hand tighter and walked on. That afternoon, Thomas had been playing near the fountain, his small boots splashing in the puddles, his laughter the only bright sound in a world that had grown so dim. I sat on a bench beneath an oak tree, my hands folded in my lap, trying not to think about the rent that was due in a week or the seamstress work I had taken on that left my fingers raw. I was 28 years old. I felt ancient. It was then that I noticed the man. He sat alone on a bench across the path, perfectly still, staring at nothing. His coat was dark and impeccably tailored, his posture rigid, and even from a distance I could sense a profound isolation about him, as though he carried winter inside his chest. There was something unsettling in his stillness, something that made me think of statues in forgotten churchyards. I looked away quickly, instinctively, the way one avoids the gaze of the grieving. But Thomas, with the fearless curiosity of a 7-year-old child, did not look away. Before I could call him back, he had left the fountain and walked directly to the man's bench. I rose immediately, my heart stuttering with panic and embarrassment. But I was too far to stop what happened next. Thomas stood before the stranger, tilting his head with that earnest expression he always wore when he was puzzling something out. The man looked down at him, startled, as if he had not realized other people existed in the park at all. I could not hear what Thomas said at first. I hurried closer, my skirts heavy with rainwater, my cheeks burning. But then Thomas's voice carried across the damp air, clear and sweet and devastating. "Don't be sad, sir. You look very sad. You may borrow my mother if you like. She is very kind, and she makes people feel better." I stopped walking. For a moment, I could not breathe. The man stared at Thomas with an expression I could not name. Shock, perhaps, or pain, or something deeper, something that looked like the breaking of a dam that had held for far too long. His eyes, gray as the London sky, moved from my son's face to mine, and I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, like cold water closing over my head. I do not know what he saw in me. A widow in a threadbare mourning dress, a woman too thin, too tired, too haunted by her own losses to be of comfort to anyone. But whatever he saw, it held him silent for a long, unbearable moment. Thomas, undeterred by the man's silence, continued in his bright, matter-of-fact way. "My mother is sad too, you see. My father died. He was an inventor. He made wonderful things, but they didn't always work. Mother says he was too curious for his own good, but I think he just wanted to help people. Don't you think that's nice, sir?" The man's jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as though he had not used it in some time. "That is very kind of you, but I do not think your mother would wish to be borrowed." I reached them then, breathless, mortified. I placed my hands on Thomas's shoulders and met the stranger's eyes, forcing myself to speak with what little dignity I could summon. "Please forgive my son, sir. He means no disrespect. He simply has a tender heart and cannot bear to see anyone unhappy." The man rose slowly from the bench. He was tall, much taller than Edward had been, and there was a presence about him that seemed to fill the space around us, a gravity that pulled at something deep inside my chest. He inclined his head, in the smallest, most formal of gestures. "There is nothing to forgive. Your son is perceptive. I am indeed sad. more than he could possibly know. He looked at Thomas again, and something in his expression softened, just barely, like frost beginning to thaw at the edges. "What is your name, young man?" "Thomas Hartley, sir. And this is my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. We live in Clerkenwell now, though we used to live in a much nicer house before father died. Mother says we are managing quite well, but I know she worries." "Thomas," I said quietly, a warning in my voice. But the damage was already done. The man studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling sense that he was reading something in my face, some hidden text I did not know I carried. Then he extended his hand, a gesture so unexpected that I hesitated before taking it. His glove was soft, expensive, and his grip was firm, but strangely gentle. "I am Ashford," he said simply. It took a moment for the name to settle, for the enormity of it to crash over me. Ashford, the Duke of Ashford. I had heard the name before, of course. Everyone had. He was a legend, a ghost, a man who had retreated from society after the death of his young wife 5 years ago and had not been seen in public since. There were rumors, always rumors, that she had died under mysterious circumstances, that he had loved her so fiercely he could not bear to live without her, that he wandered his estate like a specter, speaking to no one, allowing no one in. And here he stood, in a rain-soaked park, holding my hand. I withdrew my hand quickly, curtsying awkwardly, my mind spinning. "Your Grace," I whispered. "I did not realize. Please, forgive us. We did not mean to intrude." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Thomas again, and I saw something shift in his face, something that looked almost like longing. "Your father was an inventor, you said?" "Yes, Your Grace," I replied, my voice steadier now. "Edward Hartley. He worked in mechanics and experimental science. He believed in progress, in the possibility of improving life through innovation." I did not say the rest. That Edward had been obsessed, that he had spent our savings on materials I did not understand, that he had died in his workshop, surrounded by instruments and notebooks filled with equations I could not read, his body cold and his eyes still open, staring at something I could not see. The Duke's expression grew distant, unreadable. "I knew your husband, Mrs. Hartley." The world tilted. I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he must hear it. "You knew Edward?" "We were acquainted," he said carefully. "Briefly. Some years ago, I had an interest in certain experimental work, and he was recommended to me. We met only a handful of times, but I remember him as a man of considerable intelligence and ambition. I could not speak. My mind was racing, stumbling over questions I did not know how to ask. Why had Edward never mentioned meeting a duke? What kind of experimental work had brought them together? And why? Why was the Duke of Ashford standing here now, looking at me as though I were the answer to a question he had been asking himself for a very long time? Thomas, oblivious to the tension coiling between us, tugged at my sleeve. "Mother, may I go back to the fountain? I want to see if there are any ducks." "Yes, darling," I murmured, not taking my eyes from the Duke. "Stay where I can see you." Thomas ran off, his boots splashing happily, and I was left alone with the man whose presence seemed to draw all the air from the park. The Duke watched Thomas for a moment, then turned back to me. His eyes were shadowed, haunted, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "Your son said I could borrow you, Mrs. Hartley, that you make people feel better. I wonder if that is true. I do not know what he expected me to say. I do not know what I expected to feel. But standing there, beneath the gray sky, with the smell of wet earth and autumn leaves around us, I felt something I had not felt since Edward died. A flicker of something that might have been hope or danger or both. "I am no miracle worker, Your Grace," I said softly. "I am only a widow trying to care for her child. Perhaps that is miracle enough," he replied. And then, before I could respond, he reached into his coat and withdrew a card, pressing it into my hand. "If you find yourself in need, Mrs. Hartley, please call upon me. I have a great house with very few people in it. It is too quiet, too empty. Perhaps your son is right. Perhaps I do need to borrow someone." He did not wait for my answer. He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the mist that was beginning to rise from the ground. And I stood there, clutching the card, my heart beating like a trapped bird. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, I sat by the fire and stared at the card in my hand. The address was engraved in elegant script, Ashford Manor, Belgravia. I turned it over and over, wondering what Edward had been involved in, wondering why the Duke had looked at me with such hunger and sorrow, wondering if I dared to accept his invitation. I did not know then what I know now, that Edward's death was no accident, that the Duke carried a guilt so vast it threatened to consume him, that our meeting in the park had been the first thread pulled in a tapestry of secrets, lies, and impossible science, and that the love I would come to feel for the Duke of Ashford would be both my salvation and my undoing. But on that night, I knew only one thing. I was tired of being afraid, tired of being alone, and when I looked at that card, I felt something stir inside me that I thought had died with Edward. I felt alive. I did not call upon the Duke, not the next day, nor the one after. I placed his card in the drawer of my writing desk and tried to forget it existed. But it haunted me the way Edward's notebooks haunted me, the way his empty chair at the breakfast table haunted me. It was a thing I could not escape, no matter how firmly I closed the drawer. Thomas asked about the sad man in the park only once. He wondered aloud if we might see him again, if perhaps the gentleman had felt better after their conversation. I told Thomas that important men had important obligations and that we would likely never cross paths with him again. Thomas accepted this with the easy faith of children, and I was grateful. I did not want to explain what I could not understand myself, but 2 weeks after our encounter, a letter arrived. It came in the morning post, delivered by a boy who waited expectantly for a coin I did not have to give. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, sealed with dark blue wax, bearing a crest I recognized even before I opened it. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The letter was brief, written in a strong, controlled hand that suggested its author had chosen each word with great care. Mrs. Hartley, I find myself unable to stop thinking of our conversation in the park. Your son's kindness reminded me that there is still gentleness in the world, something I had begun to doubt. I would consider it a great favor if you would join me for tea at Ashford Manor this coming Thursday at 3 o'clock. I have matters to discuss with you regarding your late husband's work. I believe you deserve to know the full extent of what he was attempting to achieve. If this request troubles you, please disregard it entirely. But if you are willing, I will send a carriage. Ashford. I read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings in the spaces between the words. Matters to discuss regarding Edward's work. What did the Duke know? What had Edward been involved in that would bring a Duke to a public park, alone and grieving, 5 years after his own wife's death? I should have refused. A widow of modest means does not accept invitations from dukes, particularly dukes rumored to be half mad with sorrow. Society would condemn me, my landlady would whisper. And yet, beneath my fear and propriety, something else stirred, a desperate need to understand. Edward had died with secrets locked behind his teeth, and I had spent 6 months drowning in the silence he left behind. If the Duke of Ashford could offer me answers, could I afford to refuse? On Thursday, I dressed in my only respectable gown, a dark gray silk that had been my best morning dress before time and wear had faded it. I arranged my hair as neatly as I could and tried not to see the shadows beneath my eyes or the pallor of my skin. I looked like what I was, a woman surviving, not living. I left Thomas with Mrs. Brennan, our neighbor, a kind widow who had children of her own and did not ask questions I could not answer. Thomas hugged me tightly before I left, sensing perhaps that something significant was shifting, though he could not name what. The carriage arrived precisely at 2:30. It was black and polished, pulled by matched horses, and so fine that several people stopped on the street to stare as I climbed inside. I felt like an imposter, a sparrow trying to wear peacock feathers. The interior smelled of leather and something else, something faint and expensive that I could not identify. As we rolled through the streets toward Belgravia, I watched London pass by the window and wondered if I was making the greatest mistake of my life. Ashford Manor rose before me like something from a Gothic tale, It was not the largest house I had ever seen, but it was certainly the most imposing. Gray stone, tall windows, an iron gate that opened with a groan that sounded almost alive. The gardens were overgrown, beautiful in their wildness, and I could see ivy climbing the walls like desperate fingers seeking entrance. There was something melancholy about the place, something that whispered of rooms closed off and lives suspended. A butler met me at the door, an elderly man with a face like carved granite. He did not smile, but he was not unkind. He took my worn cloak without comment and led me through a hall lined with portraits. I glimpsed faces from another era, men and women in elaborate dress, their eyes following me as I passed. At the end of the hall, he opened a door and announced me in a voice that echoed, "Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace." The Duke stood by the window of what appeared to be a library. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and the room smelled of old paper and wood smoke. He turned when I entered, and I was struck again by the intensity of his presence, the way he seemed to fill a space simply by existing within it. He was dressed more casually than I had expected, in a dark jacket and waistcoat, his collar open at the throat in a way that would have scandalized any proper drawing room. But there was no one here to scandalize. Only the two of us, and the weight of all the unspoken things between us. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been relief. "Thank you for coming. I was not certain you would." "I was not certain I would either, Your Grace," I replied honestly. A ghost of something passed over his face. Amusement, perhaps, or admiration for my candor. "Please sit. I have ordered tea, though I confess I rarely drink it myself. I have forgotten the habits of polite society." I sat in the chair he indicated, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. He remained standing for a moment, studying me with that same unsettling intensity I had felt in the park. Then he moved to the chair across from me and sat, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "I will not insult you with pleasantries, Mrs. Hartley. You came here for answers, and you deserve them. Your husband and I were not merely acquainted. We were collaborators for a time on a project that consumed us both, a project that ultimately destroyed us both, though in different ways." My breath caught. "What kind of project?" The Duke's eyes grew distant, haunted. "We sought to conquer death, Mrs. Hartley, or rather, to delay it, to preserve life beyond its natural span. Your husband believed it was possible to slow the body's decay, to halt the processes that lead to aging and deterioration. He had theories, brilliant theories, about cellular regeneration and the electrical properties of living tissue. I provided him with funding, with resources, with access to materials and knowledge that would have been impossible for him to obtain otherwise. I felt cold, so cold. Why would you want such a thing?" He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, I saw the full depth of his pain. My wife, Catherine, was dying. A wasting illness the doctors could not name, could not cure. She was 23 years old, Mrs. Hartley. 23. And she was disappearing before my eyes. I would have done anything, paid any price, broken any law of God or man to save her. Your husband offered me hope. He said if we could just have more time, he could perfect his methods, he could preserve her, he could keep her with me. "And did he?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "No, she died before we could attempt anything. And afterward, I could not bear to continue. I shut down the laboratory, destroyed most of the equipment, paid your husband handsomely for his silence, and sent him away. I thought that was the end of it. But your husband could not let it go, could he? He continued on his own, obsessed with proving his theories correct." My throat tightened. "He died in his workshop, Your Grace, surrounded by machines I did not understand. The doctors said his heart failed, but I never believed them. There were burns on his hands, chemical stains on his clothes. He looked as though he had seen something terrible in those final moments." The Duke leaned back in his chair, his face gray. I feared as much. The work we were doing, it was dangerous, not just physically, but morally, philosophically. We were attempting to interfere with the natural order. There are consequences to such hubris. Tea arrived then, brought by a silent maid who poured and departed like a ghost. I did not touch my cup, neither did he. "Why did you invite me here, Your Grace? Why tell me this now?" He looked at me, and there was something raw in his expression, something that made my heart stutter. Because I am haunted, Mrs. Hartley, by Catherine, by your husband, by the choices I made and the lives I destroyed in my arrogance. When your son spoke to me in the park, when he offered me the comfort of your presence, I felt something I have not felt in 5 years. I felt seen. Not as a duke, not as a widower, not as a cautionary tale, but as a man in pain. And I realized that perhaps I do not have to carry this alone anymore. I could not speak. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of his confession. He rose suddenly, crossing to a cabinet and removing a small wooden box. He brought it back and set it on the table between us. Inside this box are your husband's notebooks, the ones he left with me before he departed. I kept them, though I should have burned them. I thought perhaps someday they might matter, that someone might understand what he was trying to do. I want you to have them, Mrs. Hartley. They belong to you. My hands shook as I reached for the box. I opened it slowly, and there they were. Edward's handwriting, his diagrams, his obsessive calculations. Tears blurred my vision. I am sorry, the Duke said softly. I am sorry I could not save him. Sorry I could not save anyone. I looked up at him, this broken man in his beautiful, haunted house, and I saw myself reflected in his sorrow. 2 people destroyed by the same ambition, the same loss, the same unanswered questions. You said you wanted to borrow me, Your Grace, that you needed someone. He nodded slowly. Then perhaps we can help each other, I said. Perhaps we can find our way out of this darkness together. He stared at me for a long moment, and then, impossibly, he smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as new ice, but it was real. I would like that very much, Mrs. Hartley. And in that moment, I knew I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I returned to Ashford Manor the following week, and then the week after that. What began as an arrangement born of shared grief became something I could not name, something that lived in the space between propriety and desire, between the past and a future I had not dared to imagine. The Duke, whose given name I learned was James, though I could not yet bring myself to use it, was not what I had expected. He was educated, yes, and carried himself with the authority of his position. But beneath the formality, there was a vulnerability that drew me like a flame draws a moth. He showed me the locked wing of the manor, where he had kept Catherine's rooms untouched for 5 years, every dress still hanging in the wardrobe, every book still marked at the page she had been reading when she became too weak to hold it. He wept when he spoke of her, and I held his hand and said nothing, because there were no words that could ease that kind of pain. In turn, I showed him Edward's notebooks. We spent hours in the library, the 2 of us bent over diagrams and equations, trying to piece together what Edward had been attempting in those final months. The Duke's knowledge was considerable, and together we began to see patterns, obsessions, a mad genius spiraling towards something both brilliant and terrible. Edward had believed he was close to a breakthrough. He had written of electrical stimulation, of chemical compounds that could slow cellular death, of a device he called the resurrection engine. The name alone made my blood run cold. But what disturbed me more was the progression of his notes, the way his handwriting grew more erratic, his theories more desperate. In the final pages, he had written the same phrase over and over, as though it were a prayer or a curse. She is still here. She never left. I do not understand this, I said one afternoon, pointing to the repeated line. Who is still here? He never mentioned anyone. He barely spoke to me at all in those last weeks. The Duke studied the page, his brow furrowed. Catherine used to say something similar in her final days. She claimed she could see people in the room who were not there. Her mother, who had died when Catherine was a child. A sister who had never been born. The doctors said it was the fever, hallucinations brought on by her illness. But she was so certain, Mrs. Hartley, so insistent that they were real. A chill ran through me. Do you think Edward was seeing things as well? That his experiments affected his mind? Or perhaps, the Duke said slowly, he succeeded in something he should not have. Perhaps he opened a door that was meant to remain closed. We sat in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the shadows lengthening across the walls. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingertips seeking entrance. I thought of Edward alone in his workshop, surrounded by his machines, speaking to someone who was not there. I thought of the Duke's wife, dying in her bed, reaching for ghosts. And I thought of myself, sitting here in this haunted house, falling in love with a man I should never have met, because I was falling in love. I could no longer deny it. It was there in the way my heart lifted when his carriage arrived, in the way I found excuses to touch his hand when we pored over the notebooks, in the way I dreamed of him at night and woke with his name on my lips. I told myself it was gratitude, companionship, the simple human need for connection. But I knew better. I had loved Edward once, in the beginning, before his obsession consumed him. But what I felt for the Duke was different, deeper, a recognition of two souls shaped by the same suffering. I did not know if he felt the same. He was careful with me, always proper, always restrained. But there were moments when I caught him watching me with an expression that made me forget how to breathe, moments when our hands would brush and neither of us would pull away, moments when the air between us seemed to hum with everything we were not saying. It was Thomas who forced the truth into the open. I had brought him to the manor one Saturday, after the Duke had suggested that a child's laughter might do the old house good. Thomas had been delighted, exploring the gardens with wide eyes, chasing butterflies, and marveling at the fountain. The Duke had watched him with a tenderness that made my throat tight, and I realized he would have been a wonderful father, had fate allowed it. We were having tea in the conservatory, the three of us, when Thomas looked up from his cake and asked with perfect innocence, "Are you going to marry my mother, sir?" I choked on my tea. The Duke went very still. "Thomas," I managed, mortified. "That is not an appropriate question." But Thomas was undeterred, his face earnest and hopeful. "Mother is much happier now that she visits you. She smiles more. And you smile too, which you did not do in the park. I think you should marry each other. Then we could all live here together, and Mother would not have to work so hard, and you would not be lonely anymore." "Out of the mouths of children," the Duke murmured, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him sharply. He was gazing at me with an intensity that stole the words from my mouth. "Mrs. Hartley," he said quietly, and I heard the shift, the formality falling away like a mask. "Eleanor, your son is a very wise young man." I could not speak, could not move. The world had narrowed to the space between us, to the question hanging unspoken in the air. "I have been alone for so long," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was content to remain so, to live out my days as a monument to the past. But you have reminded me what it feels like to be alive, to want something beyond mere existence. I do not know if I have the right to ask this, if I am being selfish or foolish or both, but your son is correct. I do not want you to leave at the end of these visits. I do not want to send you back to that cold lodging house and count the days until I can see you again. I want you here, always." Tears spilled down my cheeks. I wanted to tell him yes, wanted to throw myself into his arms and let him carry me away from every hardship, every fear, every lonely night. But the notebooks burned in my mind, the unanswered questions, the dark experiments. "There is something wrong here," I whispered. "Something we do not yet understand. Edward's death, your wife's death, the things he wrote in those final pages. We are standing on ground that may not be solid." "I know," he said, "and I am afraid of what we might discover, but I would rather face it with you than face it alone. I would rather risk everything than lose you, without ever knowing what we could have been to each other." He reached across the table and took my hand, and I let him. Thomas watched us with satisfaction, as though he had arranged the entire thing himself. "Then we will face it together," I said. "Whatever comes, but you must promise me something. Anything. No more secrets. No more locked rooms and hidden truths. If we are to do this, if we are to build something real, it must be built on honesty." He nodded solemnly. "I promise." But even as he spoke the words, I felt the shadows gathering at the edges of the room, felt the weight of the past pressing against the windows, and I wondered if honesty would be enough to save us, or if we were simply two damaged souls reaching for each other in the dark, blind to the abyss opening at our feet. That night, after Thomas and I had returned home, I lay in my narrow bed and thought about the Duke's proposal. I thought about Catherine, about Edward, about the experiments that had consumed them both, and I thought about the phrase that haunted me. She is still here. She never left. In the darkness I heard a sound, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. A woman's voice, speaking words I could not quite make out. I sat up, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. Just shadows and moonlight and the familiar creaks of an old building settling. I told myself it was my imagination, exhaustion, the strain of everything I had learned. But as I lay back down and closed my eyes, I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had followed me home from Ashford Manor, something that did not want me to marry the Duke, something that was still here and had never left. The whispers did not stop. They followed me through the days that followed, faint as breath, always just at the edge of hearing. I told no one, not even James, whose name I could finally speak aloud now that we had agreed to marry. I told myself they were nerves, the product of a mind strained by too much revelation, too much change. But I knew better. Something had awakened, and it was watching us. James insisted on a short engagement. He said he had wasted too many years already, that he would not waste another moment when happiness was finally within reach. We set the date for December, a quiet ceremony with only Thomas and a handful of witnesses. I had no family to invite, and James had distanced himself from society so completely that most of his acquaintances believed him dead to the world. It suited us both. This marriage was not for show. It was survival, salvation. Two broken people trying to become whole. But first, we had to finish what Edward had started. We had to understand the resurrection engine. James had located Edward's workshop. It had been sold after his death, the contents auctioned off to pay his debts. But the new owner was a colleague of James's, a scientist who had purchased it out of morbid curiosity and then locked it away, disturbed by what he found. James convinced him to grant us access, and on a cold November morning, we stood before the door of the place where my husband had died. I had not been here since that terrible night. The police had kept me away, and afterward, I had not possessed the strength to return. But now, with James beside me, his hand steady on my back, I found the courage to enter. The workshop was exactly as Edward had left it. Dust covered everything, but beneath the dust I could see the remnants of his obsession. Tables cluttered with glass vessels and copper coils, shelves lined with journals and specimen jars, and in the center of the room, covered with a stained cloth, a large device that hummed with a presence I could feel in my bones. James approached it slowly, then pulled away the cloth. The resurrection engine was both beautiful and terrible. It was constructed of brass and iron, with crystal chambers filled with liquid that caught the light and threw rainbow shadows across the walls. Wires ran from it in all directions, connecting to smaller mechanisms I did not recognize. At its heart was a chair, fitted with leather straps and metal contacts that would have touched the head, the chest, the hands of whoever sat within it. My God, James breathed. He actually built it. I moved closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the cold metal. What was he trying to do? Bring someone back from the dead? James shook his head slowly, his eyes scanning the device. Not bring them back. Keep them here. Look at these connections. This is designed to capture something, to hold it in place. Electrical impulses, perhaps. The energy that animates living tissue. Your husband believed the soul had a physical component, something measurable, something that could be preserved if only we had the right tools. Horror washed over me. He was trying to trap souls, or communicate with them, or prove they existed at all. James's voice was grim. We discussed such theories, but they were purely speculative. I never imagined he would go this far. A sound echoed through the workshop, a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I gripped James's arm, my heart racing. Did you hear that? He nodded, his face pale. We should leave. This place is not safe. But I could not move, because I had seen something in the corner of the room, near Edward's desk. A figure, translucent as mist, watching us with hollow eyes. It was a woman, young and beautiful, dressed in white. And I knew, with a certainty that froze my blood, that I was looking at Catherine. "James," I whispered. "Do you see her?" He turned, and the color drained from his face. "Catherine, The apparition did not speak, but she raised one pale hand and pointed at the engine, then at James, then at me. Her mouth moved, forming words I could not hear, and then she was gone, dissolved like smoke in wind. James stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. She is here. All this time, she has been here. I caught him before he fell, my own terror forgotten in the face of his anguish. We sank to the floor together, and he buried his face in my shoulder, his body shaking. I held him, stroking his hair, whispering meaningless comforts while my mind raced. Edward had succeeded. He had found a way to keep the dead tethered to the living world. But at what cost? And why were Catherine and Edward still bound to this place, unable to rest, unable to move on? We have to destroy it, I said. The engine. Whatever it is doing, it is wrong. It is keeping them trapped. James pulled back, his eyes red but determined. You are right. But first, I need to understand. I need to know if she stayed by choice or if Edward's machine bound her here against her will. I need to know if I did this to her. Over the following days, we returned to the workshop again and again, studying the engine, reading Edward's notes, trying to piece together what he had done. Thomas stayed with Mrs. Brennan during these hours, and I was grateful he was far from that terrible place. We discovered that Edward had activated the engine only once, on the night he died. His notes suggested he had been trying to contact someone to prove his theories, but something had gone wrong. The electrical discharge had been too strong. It had stopped his heart. But in that final moment, he had succeeded. He had opened a doorway between the living and the dead, and he had pulled Catherine through. She had been wandering, James realized, his voice breaking, lost between worlds, and Edward's machine gave her an anchor, a way to remain. But she was never meant to stay. The strain of it, the unnatural state of existence, it must be agony for her. We have to set her free, I said, and Edward too, if he is also here. As if in answer, the air in the workshop grew cold. The engine began to hum, its crystals glowing with a pale green light, and I heard Edward's voice, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Eleanor, forgive me. Tears streamed down my face. I forgive you, I whispered. But you must let go. You must rest. The light grew brighter, and I saw him then, standing beside Catherine. He looked tired, so tired, but there was peace in his eyes. Catherine reached for his hand, and he took it. Together, they looked at James and me, and I understood what they wanted. They wanted us to live. They wanted us to be happy. They wanted us to do what they could not. James stood, squaring his shoulders, and approached the engine. He began disconnecting the wires, dismantling the mechanisms, working with the focused intensity of a man performing a sacred duty. I helped him, my hands steady despite my fear, and as we worked, I felt the presence in the room begin to fade, the weight of grief and longing lifting like morning fog. When the final connection was severed, the engine went dark, the workshop fell silent, and I knew, with a certainty beyond logic, that they were gone. Truly, finally gone. James turned to me, and I saw my own exhaustion, my own relief, reflected in his face. We held each other in that dusty, haunted room, two survivors of a tragedy we had not caused but had inherited nonetheless. It is over, he said. Yes, I replied. Now we can begin. We left the workshop and never returned. James arranged for it to be emptied and sealed. The engine was destroyed, its pieces scattered. And on a cold December morning, with snow falling softly outside the church windows and Thomas standing between us with a ring on a velvet cushion, James and I were married. I wore a dress of deep blue, not white, for I was no innocent bride. I was a woman who had walked through darkness and emerged into light. And when James kissed me at the altar, I tasted hope and sorrow and love all mingled together, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. But that night, in the grand bedroom of Ashford Manor that was now mine, as I stood before the mirror brushing my hair, I saw a flicker of movement behind me. I turned, my heart leaping, but there was nothing there, just shadows and lamplight and the quiet settling of an old house. Still, I could not shake the feeling that we were not quite alone, that some echo of the past remained, watching over us. and I wondered if we had truly freed Catherine and Edward, or if we had only given them permission to stay in a different way. James appeared in the doorway, and I pushed the thought away. He crossed the room and took my hand, leading me to the bed, and in his arms I found the peace I had been seeking. Whatever ghosts remained, they would not haunt us tonight. Tonight belonged to the living, to love, to the future we had fought so hard to claim. Winter gave way to spring, and Ashford Manor began to change. James hired gardeners to tame the wild roses that had overtaken the walls. He opened the curtains in rooms that had been dark for years. He laughed at Thomas's stories over breakfast, and the sound of it, rich and genuine, filled the house with warmth it had not known in half a decade. We were building a life, the three of us, and it was more beautiful than anything I had dared to imagine. But the shadows did not entirely leave us. There were nights when I would wake to find James standing at the window, staring out at nothing, his face etched with old pain. There were moments when I would catch him in Catherine's former rooms, touching her things with a reverence that made my heart ache. And there were times, rare but unmistakable, when I felt that presence again, that sense of being watched by something that existed just beyond the veil of the visible world. I did not speak of it to James. He had suffered enough. And truthfully, I was not certain what I felt was real or simply the residue of trauma, the way a wound continues to ache long after it has healed. So I focused on the present, on the tangible joys of my new life. Thomas thriving in the Manor's library, his quick mind devouring books faster than I could provide them. James teaching him to ride, the two of them returning from the park with wind-blown hair and matching grins. The quiet evenings by the fire, James reading aloud while I worked on embroidery I no longer needed to sell, my hands finally allowed to create beauty instead of survival. It was Thomas who brought the truth to light, as children so often do. We had been at the manor for 4 months when he came to me one morning with a question that stopped my breath. "Mother," he said, his young face serious, "who is the lady in white who visits father in his study?" I set down my teacup carefully, willing my hand not to shake. "What lady, darling?" "The beautiful one. She comes sometimes when he is working late. She stands by the window and watches him. She looks sad, but not frightened. I asked father about her once, but he said I must have been dreaming." My heart pounded. "How many times have you seen her?" Thomas considered this. 3 times, I think. Maybe 4. She does not speak to me. But once she smiled, and I felt warm, like when you hug me before bed. That night, after Thomas was asleep, I went to James's study. He was at his desk, surrounded by papers, his face tired in the lamplight. I closed the door behind me and told him what Thomas had seen. James went very still. Then, slowly, he set down his pen and looked up at me. "I have seen her too." The admission hung between us, heavy as stone. "I thought I was losing my mind," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "After we destroyed the engine, after the wedding, I thought it was over. But she still appears, not often, not in any way that frightens me. She simply stands there, in the corner of my vision, and I feel her presence like I used to when she was alive, as though she is checking on me, making certain I am well." Tears burned my eyes. "Are you well, James?" He rose from his desk and came to me, taking my hands in his. "I am better than I have been in years, Eleanor. You have given me back my life, you and Thomas both, but I cannot help wondering if Catherine remains because she cannot rest, if she is trapped by some remnant of Edward's work that we failed to undo, or if she stays by choice, unable to let go of the life she lost." I thought of the woman I had seen in the workshop, the way she had pointed at the engine and then at us, the sorrow in her translucent face. What if she is not trapped, James? What if she is simply watching over you? Over us? What if she wants to see you happy before she can finally leave? He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his cheek. I have been so afraid to be happy, afraid it would be a betrayal of her memory, afraid I did not deserve it after failing to save her. I cupped his face in my hands, making him look at me. "You did not fail her. You loved her with everything you had, and she loved you. That kind of love does not end with death, James. It transforms. It becomes something else, something that wants only the best for those left behind. If Catherine is here, I do not think she is haunting you. I think she is blessing you." That night, we went together to Catherine's old rooms. James had not entered them since our wedding, and I had respected that boundary. But now we walked through the door, hand in hand, and I felt the air shift around us, felt that presence grow stronger. The room was exactly as she had left it. Her dresses still hung in neat rows. Her jewelry box sat on the vanity, a silver brush beside it, and on the nightstand, a small portrait of her and James on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant and full of hope. James picked up the portrait, his hands trembling. We were married only 2 years before she fell ill, 2 years of happiness, and then 5 years of grief. It does not seem fair, does it, that love should be measured in such brief moments? Life is rarely fair, I said gently, but love does not end when life does. You carry her with you still. You always will. And that is not a burden, James. It is a gift. He set down the portrait and turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the question he had been too afraid to ask. Can I love you both? Can I honor her memory while building a future with you? Yes, I said firmly. Because love is not a finite resource. It does not diminish when shared. And I do not need you to forget her, James. I need you to remember her, to cherish what you had so that you can fully appreciate what we have now. As I spoke, the air in the room grew warm. A scent of lavender filled the space, faint but unmistakable, and I felt, for just a moment, the brush of something like fingertips against my cheek, gentle as a benediction. James felt it too. I saw it in the way his eyes widened, in the way his breath caught, and then, impossibly, we heard a voice, soft as a sigh, clear as a bell. Thank you. The presence lifted. The weight that had pressed against the walls of Ashford Manor for 5 years simply dissolved, and in its place was lightness, peace, the sense of a long journey finally completed. Catherine was gone. Truly, finally gone. Not destroyed or banished, but released, free to move on to whatever awaited beyond this life. James sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking with sobs that were equal parts grief and relief. I knelt beside him, holding him while he wept, letting him mourn properly for the first time since Catherine's death. And when his tears finally subsided, when he lifted his face to mine, I saw that something had changed. The shadow that had lived behind his eyes was gone. He looked lighter, younger, unburdened. I loved her, he said hoarsely. I will always love her, but I love you too, Eleanor. And I am ready now, ready to live again, truly live. I kissed him then, there in Catherine's room, and it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. When we finally stood and left the room, James closed the door gently behind us. The next day, he would have the room cleaned and repurposed. Not erased, but transformed. A library, perhaps, or a music room. A space for life rather than memory. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. Thomas grew into a brilliant young man, his father's curiosity tempered by his stepfather's wisdom. James returned to society slowly, carefully, and together we became known for our quiet philanthropy and our support of scientific research conducted with ethics and compassion. We never spoke publicly of the resurrection engine or the experiments that had brought us together. Some secrets were too dangerous to share. But in private, on quiet evenings, James would sometimes tell me stories of Catherine, and I would tell him stories of Edward. We honored the dead by living fully, by loving deeply, by refusing to let tragedy define us. And though we never saw Catherine's ghost again, I sometimes felt her presence in small ways. A warm breeze on a cold day, the scent of lavender in a room where none grew, the sense, fleeting but certain, that someone was smiling at us from just beyond sight. On our 10th wedding anniversary, James gave me a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to Catherine. In it, he thanked her for loving him, for teaching him what it meant to be loved, and for having the grace to let him go. He asked for her blessing on our marriage, on the life we had built, on the happiness we had found in the ruins of our grief. We burned the letter together in the library fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. And as the smoke rose up the chimney and disappeared into the sky, I felt a sense of completion, of circles closing, of peace, finally, permanently won. Thomas came in then, nearly grown now, and asked what we were burning. James smiled and pulled him close, one arm around his shoulders, the other around mine. Just the past, he said, making room for the future. And that was the truth of it. We had faced ghosts, literal and metaphorical, and we had survived. We had loved and lost and loved again, and we had learned that the human heart is more resilient than we ever imagine. That hope can be found in the darkest places, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to live. I am an old woman now, and James is gone. Taken by a peaceful death in his sleep 3 winters past, Thomas has children of his own, and they run through the halls of Ashford Manor with the same joy he once did. I sit in the library most days, surrounded by books and memories, and I am content. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, I feel them near me. James and Catherine and Edward, all 3, watching over me with love and approval. And I think of that day in the park, when a lonely little boy offered his mother to a sad stranger, and how that simple act of kindness changed everything. "Don't be sad," Thomas had said. "You may borrow my mother." And the Duke had borrowed me, and I had borrowed his grief. And together, we had transformed both into something beautiful. That is what love does. It takes what is broken and makes it whole. It takes what is lost and finds it again. It takes what is ending and turns it into a beginning. And so, as the light fades and the shadows lengthen, I close my eyes and smile, knowing that when my time comes, I will walk into that darkness unafraid. Because I know what waits on the other side. Not an ending, but a reunion.